Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Great to see you here. Hi, everyone. I'm Hope. For those who haven't met me already, it's great to have you here today. Excited to see you, Paxton and Dushima, Rafiq and Stella, Kamsaka and Meyer, Stephanie, Paxton, Ali, and Emmanuel. Great to see you all joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a minute or two, but before we do, we're going to move to the next slide. And just as a reminder, we're going to keep our video on if possible, but we know that there are low bandwidth areas, so no pressure. I'll keep my video on when I'm talking at least. Just a reminder to unmute your mic when you're talking, but mute it otherwise. We'll use the chat for responses and questions, and you can toggle between Zoom and your internet browser to see the presentation. We'll be working in the presentation today. And then also we have transcription available. So if you want transcription, go ahead and use the Zoom feature to access that now. But as we open today's session, we'd love to just take a moment to reflect with you in the chat. So the question that we have for you today, and you can see that it's on the slide here, is last week we talked about the concepts of systems thinking, inclusion, and resilience. How do you think these concepts overlap and complement each other? How do you think the concepts of systems thinking, inclusion, and resilience overlap and complement each other? So just take a minute, jot down some thoughts in the chat. How do you think the concepts of systems thinking, inclusion, and resilience overlap and complement each other? We talked about systems thinking last week with the cats in Borneo video, mosquitoes and malaria, and cats and rats. We talked about inclusion. We looked at various definitions of inclusion. We talked about resilience, looked at various definitions of resilience. How do you think these concepts of systems thinking, inclusion, and resilience overlap and complement each other? So go ahead and type in the chat now, and we're going to send our responses in just a minute. So go ahead and continue typing. And welcome, Abdi Nasir. Abu Bakar, great to see you. Welcome, Uba. Welcome, Rahila. We're just taking a moment to type in the chat. Welcome, Cute. How do you think these concepts overlap and complement each other? If you've got your response ready, go ahead and press send. If you're still working on your response, go ahead and wrap it up now. But we'd love to hear from you. How do you think these concepts, systems thinking, inclusion, resilience, overlap and complement each other? We've got systems thinking, we've got inclusion, resilience. How do we think these concepts overlap and complement each other? Is there a connection between systems thinking and inclusion? A connection between systems thinking and resilience? Go ahead and type in the chat now and send your response when you're ready. Maybe we're still thinking, maybe we're still typing in the chat. I wonder if anyone has a thought about this question. Maybe we can take one or two responses verbally if we're still typing. But I'm starting to see responses come in, so continue throwing those in there if you can. So response from Rafiq, systems will provide underlying causes and consequences that help for identifying the target population, so inclusion, thinking about those marginalized groups, and potential program resilience. All of these are interrelated. Absolutely, Rafiq. That's such a important observation, bringing the inclusion, bringing the resilience together, and thinking about the system as a whole to enable both of those things. Excellent. Welcome, Tsitsi. Great to have you join us. Any other reflections on this question? How we think the concepts of systems thinking, inclusion, and resilience overlap and complement each other? All right, Baxton, thank you. The recognition of the interconnectedness of different elements makes it easier to build resilience by understanding how different effectors affect and influence each other. Absolutely. And in particular, thinking about how those different factors affect and influence different kinds of individuals in the system helps us bring in that inclusion piece as well. So that's so important. Thanks for that reflection. Emmanuel is saying a way of making sense of the complexity of the world by looking at it in terms of wholes and relationships rather than splitting it down into parts. It has a relationship with inclusion and resilience. Absolutely. Not just focusing on our sector or our intervention or our tiny, tiny piece, but thinking about the broader whole. From Ali, a system where everyone has equal access and equal opportunity will allow state sustainability and resilience. Absolutely. And from Admire, systems thinking allows us to consider connectedness of issues, and inclusion and resilience allow us to take everyone on board and build capacity of individuals and communities to adapt and cope with shocks and stresses. Amazing. These are great reflections. Thank you all so much for taking the time to engage in that chat storm with us. Now we're going to move into a bit of a game. We're going to think about some definitions of inclusive resilience. And so we're going to look at those definitions together. So on the next slide, you'll see that we aggregated the definitions you came up with during the last session for inclusive resilience, and we're showing them on this slide here. So we've got option 1, when individuals all have equitable opportunity to access and utilize resources, empowering them to cope with shocks and stresses. Option 2, systematic program design aimed at building the capacity of all groups of people focused on the most marginalized and vulnerable to create enabling environment. And option 3, the ability of individuals, households, communities, countries, and systems to adapt, mitigate, and respond to shocks and stresses in an equitable manner. So we're going to take a moment and look at these definitions. We think all the ones that you shared with us are fabulous, including the things you're continuing to put in the chat. Amazing. But we're going to take a moment now and just vote. Which of these inclusive resilience definitions resonates most with you? And we'll take a little poll, and whichever definition has the most votes, we're going to put up when we're in the room together in Harare next week. So we're going to launch that poll now and take a moment and think which of these options, option 1, 2, or 3, resonates most with you. What does inclusive resilience mean to you from these options available? And you can go ahead and cast your votes now. And while you do, I'm going to read out some additional observations in the chat. So inclusive systems combine the principles of both inclusive and systems thinking. Absolutely, Uba. Stella says understanding different groups' diversity helps to identify interventions that address specific issues for inclusive resilience. Absolutely. And from Cute, we have systems thinking, inclusion, and resilience interconnectedness allows for holistic response and implementation. Amazing. So we're just going to take one more minute and cast your vote now in that poll. We see about 5 respondents so far, so would love to see everyone just take a moment and cast their vote on their favorite inclusive resilience definition. And as a reminder, we've got option 1, option 2, option 3. What does inclusive resilience mean to you? Which of these definitions really speaks to the things that we were talking about yesterday? Things that you're thinking about? We'll give it one more moment. So cast your vote if you haven't already. What does inclusive resilience mean to you? All right, last chance to cast your vote, and we'll show the responses here. Got a couple more in. All right, let's reveal the winner, Matheson. Okay, so we've got option 3 coming in as the winner here, the ability of individuals, households, communities, countries, and systems to adapt, mitigate, and respond to shocks and stresses in an equitable manner, focusing on men, women, youth, people with disabilities, the elderly, other marginalized groups to reduce vulnerability and produce sustainable and inclusive growth. We also saw strong votes for options 1 and 2. Those are great definitions as well. But just a quick round of applause for option 3. This is the definition we will have in the room with us in Harare next week. So thank you for your thoughts. So we'll go to the next slide and just talk quickly about the agenda for today. We'll look at the purpose of QI, also known as qualitative inquiry. Why do we do qualitative inquiry? We'll talk about the complementarity of quantitative and qualitative approaches and what we gain when we bring these approaches together. We'll talk about the role of qualitative inquiry in inclusive resilience, or IRQI, as it's abbreviated there. And then we'll close with a discussion of what comes next. So we'll talk about different data we can select to prepare for our in-person context analysis activity together. So on the next slide, you'll see that we are on the 3rd virtual session here, focusing on situating qualitative inquiry within the broader MEL system. We'll spend a little time today connecting back to previous sessions, that common language we developed for inclusive resilience and the role of qualitative inquiry that we'll use for all future sessions. And as I said, we'll also talk about the differences and similarities between quantitative and qualitative approaches and identify opportunities where we might just do one of those or where we can layer and sequence them. It's also important in this session to talk about why qualitative inquiry is critical for MEL systems in general, but also for programs aiming towards inclusive resilience. So we'll do a little bit of that today as well. So with that, I'll pass it over to Emily. Emily, over to you.
Thanks, Hope. Now we are going to kick off this session by going into breakout rooms now for about 20 minutes. In those breakout rooms, we're going to play another game to reflect on the use cases of quantitative versus qualitative approaches and examining the types of questions, situations, data that require us to take certain approaches. And then we're going to reflect on why we might want to use qualitative versus quantitative data in those situations. During the game, it's important to remember that we're not pitting qualitative over quantitative or encouraging ourselves to just choose one approach over the. Instead, we need to use a variety of approaches and strategies with a clear understanding of the type of approach that can help us explore specific types of questions and where quantitative and qualitative data can complement each other. So before we go into the breakout rooms, make sure you're able to join us in the slides. If you're not already there, Matheson has dropped the link in the chat, and we'll be playing the game in the slides. So hopefully you'll be able to join us there. All right. We're going to have about 20 minutes, and Matheson will break us out into breakout rooms now.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you so much for engaging in that discussion. Really, really interesting to hear from so many of you and to see your votes on those questions as well. I leave this slide up here. Welcome back to the main room. I leave this slide up here mostly as a challenge to us as we go into our in-person workshop in Harare. We're going to talk about each one of these challenges in detail at various points throughout that workshop and offer some suggestions, but also hear from you of ways that you've mitigated some of these concerns in the past. And so we're really, really excited to have that opportunity to really surface some of the things that make us uncomfortable about qualitative inquiry, maybe haven't gone as well in the past, and try to plan ahead for those through the design of our qualitative inquiry or QI project. So thank you so much for that reflection. And just as a reminder, as we saw, a lot of those qualitative and quantitative questions, there's value that each kind of approach can have, and most of our work is a combination. So we'll talk a little bit more about that now, and why we used a spectrum. So we'll go to the next slide. So as we saw in that reflection, quantitative and qualitative methods are often used to answer different types of questions. So quantitative questions often ask how many, or how much, how often, or how frequently, while qualitative questions often ask why. Why are there, or how does something do something else, or why does something happen? What is, or what are? And what factors might influence things. So a really helpful way to think about those two is by thinking about some of those questions that come up. So while we often hear about qualitative or quantitative methods as sort of a binary, either you can do one or the other, we often use a combination of approaches. Maybe we'll layer the two of them together, as we saw in some of the previous voting exercises. And sometimes we even combine them in the same study or in the same survey or focus group discussion without even realizing it. So for example, many of you may have conducted a focus group discussion before. Maybe you start with a participatory exercise like a pile sorting or a voting exercise. While you're doing an FGD, this is still a method that results in a number, a quantitative number. Maybe 10 people vote for this, 9 people vote for that. Or maybe many of you have written or delivered survey tools, questionnaires, but at the end of that survey tool, there's an open-ended question. What other feedback do you have for us? Any recommendations for the program? Sometimes the survey will include an open-ended question and maybe some probing questions to get behind that. And as many of you know very, very well from your experience with big studies like baselines or midterm evaluations, end lines, or end of project evaluations, they often use a variety of qualitative and quantitative methods, as we've talked about, and as some of you mentioned in the last discussion. So that's why we use this spectrum. We also want to keep in mind that qualitative and quantitative approaches have different definitions of good, but those definitions, while different, are still trying to get to some of the same principles. So while we're in person together, we'll look more at how to define and achieve a high quality in qualitative inquiry. But it's important to note that ultimately both approaches are really trying to maximize their truth value. Basically, are the conclusions that both methods are drawing accurate? The consistency, so is the evidence clear? The neutrality, so does the evidence look at both sides without bias? And the applicability, so can the conclusions be applied for other applications? So in other words, while qualitative inquiry might not be statistically generalizable, the deep insights from qualitative inquiry are often transferable, meaning that qualitative inquiry can still offer very rich, very detailed descriptions that illuminate the truth of a specific experience or phenomenon. So that's something important to remember in the applicability principle. You'll also notice here that qualitative inquiry has one more principle than quantitative inquiry, and that's reflexivity. So we'll talk more about what this means in person, but reflexivity is really about critical self-awareness and ongoing examination of the research or intervention process to acknowledge and consider the influence of the researcher's biases, assumptions, and experiences. And as I said, we'll talk a lot more about reflexivity when we're in person together. So this next slide shows a couple of different examples of how qualitative and quantitative approaches can be layered and sequenced together. So none of them are right per se, rather this is a menu of options, some of which you'll definitely have used, that might be particularly well suited to a specific program or to a specific research question or approach. So the first one on the top left is an exploratory exercise. Often we do, when we're trying to construct a new framework of understanding, we might start off with qualitative inquiry, which then we follow up with quantitative methods. So you might see this frequently in a needs assessment, which is often qualitative, and then we conduct the baseline, which is primarily quantitative. So we use a qualitative method to explore what are the needs in this area, what do different populations need, and then we use a baseline to measure quantitatively our indicators based on our understanding of those needs. The next one on here is explanatory on the bottom left. So maybe there's something that triggers us to ask deeper qualitative questions. We might conduct a quantitative assessment, maybe it's our post-distribution monitoring, or we conduct a community visit, maybe we're discussing with a community leader. And then we identify an unanswered question or a surprising finding that we want to pursue with qualitative inquiry, essentially to ask why or how or why not behind that quantitative or other finding. So that can be an explanatory exercise. And then on the right-hand side, we have the parallel or convergent exercises, where we can do qualitative inquiry at the same time as our quantitative measures, and then compare or triangulate our data sources and interpret them side by side. So just to note, a lot of you for the qualitative inquiry projects that we do together as part of this fellowship, they might be part of a standalone qualitative monitoring or qualitative study in combination with existing or future quantitative work. So I'll pass it to Emily to take us through the next section.
Thanks, Hope. So now we're going to spend a little bit more time looking at the role of qualitative inquiry in a program scenario. If you remember from our last session that we created a shared language of inclusive resilience, you provided some great definitions earlier today that we voted on, and we watched the Cats in Borneo video about systems thinking. Now we're going to spend a little bit more time examining the role of qualitative inquiry and how it helps us deepen our understanding of inclusive resilience dynamics within our programs and the systems in which they operate. To do that, we're going to look at some program scenarios, and these scenarios will reflect on the role of qualitative inquiry and how it fits within the broader MEL system, similar to what Hope just shared. This, fair warning, is going to be a lot of me talking, but as I talk through this scenario, I want you to explain the role of qualitative inquiry. I also want you to reflect on your own programs and the data that you brought with you today, because we're going to be doing a very similar mapping exercise when we're together next week in person, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. All right, so in this program scenario, this imaginary program has just received its annual review data, revealing conflicting statistics regarding income and food security among participant households. The data indicates some notable trends. First, income at the household level has increased compared to the previous year. You can see this in the data point on the yellow on the left-hand side. This suggests a positive economic trajectory. Maybe the program's interventions are working, which is great news. Another good news story is that malnutrition rates for adult women and children under 5 have decreased. However, the malnutrition rates for men and boys haven't changed. As you will see on the purple box on the right-hand side, this might raise some additional questions about the effectiveness of the program's interventions targeting specific demographics in the household. Something to take into consideration. And lastly, the annual review data also showed that dietary diversity is decreasing for all family members, which might signal challenges in accessing a range of nutritious food options. As you will see on the slide, the program also received some additional data on conflict and dry spells, leading to the disruption of food markets and increased food insecurity. But for the sake of time, we'll glance over that for now. So as I was reading through some of those data points, maybe you thought of some connections between the data and the program outcomes that the program was seeing. For example, on the top of the slide, we might speculate that the program intervention has caused an increase in household income compared to the previous year, and that in turn has led to decreased malnutrition. Or maybe it's just that the program's interventions are resulting in decreased malnutrition for women and children under 5 in its own right. Or at the bottom of the slide, we could hypothesize that the outbreak of international conflict, which has disrupted food markets, is lowering agriculture productivity, and that the increase in dry spells outside of the dry season is similarly reducing the availability of food. Both shocks are creating challenges in accessing a range of nutritious food options, which then results in lower dietary diversity for all household members. But these are just hypotheses, and we're making a lot of assumptions about the relationship between the data and the program outcomes. There's also a lot we don't know about the program based on the data we have. So if you think back to last week about the systems thinking session we did and the 5 resilience questions that we talked about, we might want to use those 5 resilience questions to understand more about our context. For example, we could think about resilience for whom? In other words, which social identity groups are most vulnerable to shocks and stresses? In this case, I could ask, who is most vulnerable to malnutrition and why? Or we could think about resilience of what? What are the systemic constraints that drive vulnerability? If we ask of what, we might wonder, how are decisions made about how to allocate nutritious food in the household? Or think about resilience to what end? What are the well-being outcomes or intermediate goals we are working towards? We could ask, why is increased income not leading to a decrease in malnutrition among males? Is it related to our program or something else? And for the last question on this slide, we could think about resilience through what? In other words, what are the resources or resilience capacities we are trying to support for the target population? In this case, productive income is an important resource. So we might wonder, who has access to productive income? Who makes decisions about how it's spent? If we look at the next scenario about the dry spells and international conflict, we could think about the shocks and stresses on this slide. Resilience to what? What are the shocks and stresses we are trying to create resilience towards? As I just said, we know that international conflict and dry spells are shocks and stresses to this program, but we might wonder about the follow-on effects. What kinds of foods are no longer available in the market or are experiencing price increases? And because this is the Cultivate Fellowship and inclusive resilience is important to us, we could ask again, resilience for whom? Whose dietary diversity is the lowest, or whose is decreasing the most? So now that we've mapped these connections and have identified that we still have persisting questions, we need to start thinking about which of these questions might be best addressed through qualitative inquiry and which are better suited for existing quantitative data collection exercises. In this example, questions like, are the prices of certain foods on the rise and whose dietary diversity is lowest or decreasing the most can probably be answered through existing quantitative data collection activities. If you click one more time, we'll see that in this example, we could use market monitoring or data desegregation to answer the questions on the left through existing quantitative data collection. However, for the questions on the right, including who has access to this income and who makes decisions about how to spend it, and how are decisions made about how to allocate nutritious food within the household, are questions that would be better answered through qualitative data collection. So to connect back to our earlier slide about how quantitative and qualitative data can be sequenced and layered, in this scenario, the program used its annual survey to shine light on new areas that need further explanation. So their annual survey was quantitative data. They looked at it and realized that they still had some outstanding questions that they would use qualitative inquiry to then address. So let's take a moment and I will stop talking to reflect together on this question. In this specific scenario, why might we use QI or qualitative inquiry, or what would we be missing without qualitative inquiry in this case? Go ahead and type responses into the chat. How does QI help us in this scenario? Again, we that quickly went over different questions that we could ask using quantitative or qualitative data. We've identified that we need qualitative data to answer the two questions on the right-hand side. Whose access to this income and who makes decisions about how it's spent would be best asked through qualitative data. How are decisions made about how to allocate nutritious food in that household? That's a good question for qualitative data. Getting information firsthand, thanks. That's a great idea. Help us shed light on some of the dynamics we're seeing within the household and the system. It helps us delve deeper into the insights, perceptions, attitudes of the people, absolutely. Context analysis and understanding the issues affecting people, absolutely. Understand deeper why there's no decline in malnutrition for men and boys, absolutely. Helps us dig deeper to identify the missing information that quantitative data doesn't tell us. Yes, all of these things are true. So I think you all pretty much helps us understand norms and beliefs influencing access to food and decision-making powers. Absolutely. I think you have all helped us. I think you've already answered the questions for me. It's more exploratory. So as you noted, without this qualitative inquiry, we would miss the opportunity to explore our assumptions. Qualitative inquiry helps us uncover why this is happening and how this is happening. The insights from qualitative inquiry might inform our future programming and, help us realize that maybe we need to adjust our programming or our activities or our targeting strategies. As you've pointed out, it also helps us understand for whom. Connecting it back to our other session helps us understand the inclusive resilience perspectives and ensure that our programming is making change for the most marginalized. Yes, exactly getting into the behaviors, attitudes, and social issues. It also helps us be more likely to improve our programming based on the triangulation of data. I know in my small group earlier, we talked a lot about triangulating data. And if we know why our program isn't meeting context or what it is ignoring about our context, we'll be better positioned to adjust our programming to make up for those gaps. And it can also help us expand our understanding of the system in which this is all happening, the connections, interdependencies, and dynamics, and how we might contextualize our insights within this understanding. So to conclude, that was a mini case study version of the exercise we're going to do together in Zimbabwe next week. Essentially, we're going to draw from your program data to map your context, summarizing what you already know in the areas in which you're working, and then also asking questions. We'll question our assumptions and we'll identify things we might need to understand better about the areas in which we work. And these gaps are what's going to form the basis of your qualitative inquiry projects. But in order to be ready to undertake that exercise, we first need to brainstorm what data sources we need to bring to Zimbabwe to enable this discussion. So with that in mind, I'll pass it back to Hope to facilitate that brainstorming.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you all for walking through that mini case study together with us. It's so great to have you reflect on those questions together, to think about the different case study factors that we might consider about our particular program context when we're in person. And with that in mind, as Emily said, we're going to now think about some of the data sources we might bring to that discussion. So on the next slide, you'll see we asked you in the last pulse check, which many of you completed, thank you so much, about the data sources that you're planning to bring together for that data, that contextual analysis, where, as Emily said, we'll pull out some of the relevant data pieces, some of the why, some of the for whom, some of the different elements of the resilience questions, and put them all together in a map of what we think our context looks like. And then we'll talk about some of the assumptions or open questions that we have that are going to inform the design of our qualitative inquiry projects together. So this slide is showing some of the data sources that you all mentioned. We heard different quantitative and qualitative data from other programs, not just the program that you all are working on. We heard about baseline, midterm evaluation reports, gender, youth, and social dynamic study reports, and rapid youth employment assessments, post-shock surveys, post-distribution data, panel study reports, graduation criteria data, beneficiary lists, feedback mechanism data and reports, and then also, really importantly, the theory of change, the logical framework. Some of you might have resilience pathways. So all of this is going to be essential to bring together when we're in person. And we wanted to put this in front of you in case it spurs some of your thinking. So maybe you were just planning on bringing your GYSD study report, but then seeing this, you remember, oh yes, actually I have some resilience pathways mapped, or I have a needs assessment report or a post-shock survey that I really want to bring to have with me when we're in person. So we wanted to share some of these with you. Just seeing a note in the chat from Abraham, can I use the rapid assessment on the effectiveness of, on the effect of conflict on youth employment outcomes? Absolutely. Absolutely. That sounds like a great study that would be great to have when we're in person together. So when we go into breakout rooms shortly, we'll discuss, based on today's session, our little mini case study, are there any data sources that we really need to add? So thinking just outside of what our program has collected, are there other data sources that maybe other programs or other organizations have collected that we need to bring? Then thinking a little bit about, is everything that's on here very, pretty recent and relevant, thinking the last like 3 to 7 years? And what else might we consider? We can give each other some feedback. Oh, I see you have this study. Maybe do you also have a logical framework you can bring to the table? That kind of thing. So we'll go into breakout rooms now. We'll have different breakouts for different programs. So Emily will be in one, Julie in the other, and myself in a third. And then we'll have a little discussion. So we'll come back in about 15 minutes. So with that, great. Thank you all so much for engaging in that together with us. Just as a reminder, this is just the beginning of the discussion. Please feel free to take a couple of additional minutes after today's session, gather all the things you want to bring in person, maybe put them in a folder, or if you've got a printed copy you want to have with you, feel free to bring that. But we're really, really looking forward to digging into this data together in person. So with that in mind, just a reminder to pull up this slide when you're back at your desk. Add new things to your list or put things together in a folder, save them on your laptop so you don't have to go online to access them or whatever. And we'll use these together when we're in person. So I'll pass it to Emily for our final session.
Yeah, thanks, Hope. So just some announcements and reminders to close us out today. As you have done the last two sessions, please complete the pulse check form that Matheson has just dropped into the chat. We always appreciate your thoughts and feedback on the session, and it helps us continuously improve the workshop or the fellowship. And so we always appreciate your thoughts and reflections in the pulse check. So please be sure to complete it after today's session. And now some updates on travel and logistics. As for hotel booking confirmations, our colleagues in Zimbabwe have clarified that booking confirmations are not needed for the visa process. Please just be sure to have your invitation letter that we shared with you via email, as immigration officers may ask for this if you are applying for a visa on arrival. And if you haven't already indicated that you want a space at the hotel, rest assured, we have confirmed hotel bookings for everyone, even if you haven't said so already. So no worries there. The hotel is ready for you, and everything that's all taken care of. As for payments, the hotel accepts credit card payments, Visa or MasterCard, as well as cash payments. The cost of the hotel is $110 per night. And if you plan on paying when you arrive, your organization should be able to provide you a cash advance if you would prefer not to use a personal payment method. If, however, your organization is requesting an advanced payment, or your organization would prefer to pay ahead of time, please let us know as soon as possible, ideally today. By the end of today, we are trying to coordinate with our colleagues in Zimbabwe to find a solution to this. And so if this is important to you, we need to know as soon as possible so that we can share an update on what this will look like. And then transportation from the airport. If you requested transportation from the airport to the hotel, this has already been arranged. We will share more details about what to look for when you arrive later this week. And please note that this transportation is paid for by Gaya, so you don't need to worry about paying the taxi driver upon arrival. And I will stay online after this session to answer any questions you may have about travel or logistics. So if you have any outstanding questions, don't end the call, and I'll be online to help you sort through those in a minute. And lastly, we're going to have a Miro tutorial this Thursday. As we have mentioned already, we'll be using Miro quite a bit throughout the in-person workshop. And so this tutorial will review the basics and may be useful if you haven't used Miro previously, or you're less familiar with how to use Miro. We highly recommend you join us for this tutorial, but if you can't make it, we will share a recording afterwards and can share follow-up exercises in a board for you to practice yourselves. But again, if we will need to be using it, so if you haven't used it before, we encourage you to join us this Thursday, 2 p.m. West Africa time, 3 p.m. Central Africa time, and 4 p.m. Eastern time, if you can make it. And just to reiterate, I'll be online afterwards to answer questions. Please fill out the pulse check form. And thank you so much for another great workshop. I think we can end a few minutes early unless you have any travel questions. We're excited to see you all in person very soon.